And before we have our class, we'll have a word of prayer. Let's pray together. Our Almighty Father in heaven, we thank you so much for the gift of life that you've given us and the opportunity we have this evening to study your word. And we pray that you'll help us as we examine the scriptures to find things in them that will be applicable to our lives, find ways that we can become more conformed to your image and your glory. Help us, Father, as we study the scriptures to focus on your Son, Jesus, and all we can do to become like him. Forgive us of our sins. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, well, we are in 2 Kings chapter 4. 2 Kings chapter 4, and I realize I just gave away my last question handout, so now I don't know what the questions are. Oh, no, I mean, if somebody wants to refer to them. And basically, I have more question handouts for next time. Don't let me forget to pass them out at the end of class. They'll kind of, I'm printing this booklet up piecemeal because the copier doesn't like me, so that's kind of been the way it's been going. But in 2 Kings chapter 4, we're in the middle of a series of stories about the prophet Elisha and the series of miracles he performs during the reign of Joram, the king of Israel, and later Jehoshaphat and Jehoram, king of Judah. There's a lot of similarities between Elijah and Elisha. Elijah, and you're going to see some of them in this chapter even. Elijah multiplies oil and grain for the widow in 1 Kings 17. Elisha multiplies oil for a widow in 2 Kings 4. Both prophets are responsible for bringing a dead boy back to life. We're going to see that in this chapter. And both prophets are also involved in giving oracles to dying kings. And they both work during times of famine and drought. We'll see several things like that throughout this text. But I want to begin by looking at 2 Kings chapter 4. And can I get a volunteer to read verses 1 through 7? Verses 1 through 7 of 2 Kings chapter 4. Go ahead. All right, so first of all, this widow, she's in a nasty debt situation. Why is she in that situation? Well, yeah, she's a widow. Then that probably tells you everything you need to know right there. It's the ancient world, and widows do not do well in the ancient world very much. And this widow is left with substantial outstanding debts that she can't pay, probably in part due to something her husband left behind. Now the creditor has come to collect on the debt, and if she doesn't pay, her children will be sold as slaves to cover the expense. That's not a pretty situation. Now, we might be tempted to blame the deceased. Shouldn't he have known better? But, the reality is, well, that's not the point of the text, and may not even really be a fair reading of what he's saying. Or what it's saying here, because sometimes crises in life come up, you can't do anything about it. What's more interesting, though, is who was this man that died? He's one of the sons of the prophets. And who are the sons of the prophets? We talked about that a little bit in a previous class. There's most weren't here in the previous class, I guess, now that I think about it. But yeah, there was a kind of a school of prophets, if you will. It was a group of prophets. They were kind of like disciples of Elisha that hung around him. basically. And this guy was one of them. He was he was one of the faithful remnant of Israel. He wasn't a Baal worshiper. He wasn't one of the calf idolaters. He's a faithful son of the prophets. He's one of Elisha's disciples. And he's left with all of this debt for whatever reason, which raises this question, instead of being quick to blame the deceased, we should raise this question that, how is he described in verse 1? He is a servant who feared the Lord, who feared Yahweh. The fact that he feared God leads to a question. Does faithfulness to God count for anything? The man feared God. What benefit was there for him? He's dead. His family has been left insolvent. They're destitute. His children are going to have to be sold. What's going to happen to this guy? What good is his fear of God doing them right now? And so that's the dilemma that this story confronts us with. Does faithfulness towards God count towards anything? What do you think? And the fact that she's able to go to Elisha for help is a clear-cut solution to this. So she shows up and she tells Elisha about the problem. And Elisha asks, well, what shall I do for you? Which is kind of interesting. You remember back in chapter 3 when Elisha was inquired of by King Joram. How did he respond to Joram? In chapter 3, in verses 13. How did Elisha respond when he went to Joram? When Joram came to him to inquire of him. He said, no way. I wouldn't help you. He's like, first of all, go consult your mother's prophets. I wouldn't even talk to you if Jehoshaphat weren't here. Right? And here in chapter 4, this widow, who has no way to pay him back really, comes to him and says, I need help. Elisha says, what shall I do? Elisha is more willing to help the poor widow than he is to help the king of Israel. Because that's the way God operates. It's not your status in society that matters. It's the fact that you are faithful to the Lord. Elisha is not a prophet for monetary hire or political favor. He himself acts out of the fear of God to help the helpless. And what does the widow have to start with? She has a jar of oil. And what does that tell us about her? Now, the oil isn't really a sign of, that she's wealthy here. If anything, it's like, this is all I got left. You go to your pantry, you open it up, and the only thing in it is a jar of oil, and you've got no other food in there. It's time to go to the grocery store. If that's not readily available, then you're probably in a little bit of trouble. But this woman's plight is very similar to the widow of Zarephath in 1 Kings 17 that Elijah went to in the time of famine. She has children, she has a little jar of oil, she has nothing but death to look forward to. The deceased, he's not an entrepreneur, he's poor. They're left with no assets. This is a pathetic beginning. That jar of oil isn't there so Elisha can go, hey, it's a widow helper starter kit. That's not what he's saying here. That's not what this is. In fact, the fact that she's reduced to a single flask of oil is a sign of being pathetic. It is a sign to readers of how hopeless, how destitute she is. The question, what do you have? Jesus asks a similar question to that, actually, in the Gospels. Whenever they've got huge, massive people they've got to feed, the disciples come to him, oh, Jesus, we can't feed these people, send them away. Jesus asks them, what do you have? What do you have? Well, we have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. That's not going to feed 5,000 people. And, well, just like with Elisha, there, God starts with what is utterly insignificant and works with that. Because that's the way it is with each and every one of us. God starts with what is utterly insignificant. He works with that. And then, you keep reading. He has her go borrow a bunch of empty pots from the neighbors, as many as she can get. Shut the door. Pour the oil into the pots. No, is Elisha actually present for this miracle? He's not even there. Why do you think that is? What does that tell us about the miracle? it's from God, not from Elisha. Exactly. Elisha kind of does this several times, tries to distance himself from the miracle. He sends a delegate to raise the Shunammite's son at first. In chapter 5, he doesn't even go with Naaman to the Jordan River. He just sends him away to the Jordan. And on it goes. Elisha distances himself from the miracles because the miracle is not coming from him, a mere man. It's coming from God. Not only that, does she go out in the street and start, look, multiplying oil. Is that what she does here? What does she do? Go in, close the door. Why? There's sort of a secrecy thing going on here. God's work isn't always for public consumption. There's a lesson in that. His glory isn't just for anyone, it's for those who seek Him. The neighbors might have their suspicions. They might think, where did you borrowed all our pots? Where did you get all the money? How did you suddenly get out of debt? Did God intervene for her? Well, that's between her and the Lord and us, the readers, and Elisha. But the neighbors kind of locked out of it. It's similar to the Gospels when Jesus performs His first miracle in John chapter 2. He has these wedding servants pour out water, deliver it to the head waiter. Very few people are aware that a miracle is actually taking place when Jesus turns water into wine. The disciples know it because they saw Him do it. And the servants know it. The head waiter doesn't even know it. Because that's the glory of God. It's not always for public consumption. Sometimes it's working in the background. Sometimes it's hidden from our view. All right, so that's... and so she pours out. Her sons are bringing her pots. They stop bringing pots. The oil stops. And as a result of that, pagans might expect Elisha to perform prophetic magic, wave his hands over the pots, do a little voodoo dance or something. But that's not what happens. Because it's God who presents the oil, not Elisha summoning it out of the air with sleight of hand. He doesn't take credit for what happens. As a result, the response is sell the oil, pay the debts, live on the rest. The widow is not rewarded with wealth. She's rewarded enough to get out of her situation and provide for her needs. Any comments or thoughts or questions on verses 1 through 7? All right, let's move on to the Shunammite. And the Shunammite woman, her story is told in two parts, fairly lengthy. I need a volunteer first to read verses 8 through 17. Verses 8 through 17. Okay? Alright, so when Elisha comes to Shunem, one of the town's prominent women persuades him to eat at her house, and this turns into a regular thing, and eventually she has her husband build an extra room on their house with a bed and a table, a chair, and a lampstand. Elijah may have had an upper room residence with the widow of Zarephath, but this appears to be more constructed specifically for Elisha. When I go to India, several of the people there, they build these extra rooms onto the top of their houses for preachers to stay in. And they call them Elijah rooms. And I always wondered why in the world you call them Elijah rooms instead of Elisha rooms. So they get the two prophets confused over there too. But what's happening here? What happens as a result of the hospitality is Elisha grants the Shunammite woman a son. Why that gift in particular? Why a son? What does that remind us of from earlier? It sounds a lot like Abraham. How does it sound like Abraham? Yeah, they're too old to have children. And of course, any time in the Bible that somebody can't have children, it is explicitly said to not be able to have children, by the end of the story they wind up having children. That's how it works in Bible times. But this is one of those things here. This woman, their age makes it impossible, like Abraham and Sarah, to have children. But Elisha offers her anything she wants. Do you want royal favor? Do you want me to put in a good word for the king for you? No, that wouldn't really do me any good because I live among my people. She's pretty well off. That's going to change when we get to chapter 8, by the way. We'll talk about that when we get to chapter 8. And Gehazi points out, well, she has no children, so Elisha promises her a son, and within the year. And she kind of has the same reaction that Sarah did. That's ridiculous. Don't get my hopes up. The idea of a couple their age having kids is absurd. Miracles don't happen anymore, right? Well, in this story they do. And just like Elisha said, the woman conceives, she gives birth to a son at that time next year. Children, it's interesting, children are blessings in and of themselves. God provides a miraculous child here, but unlike a lot of the miraculous children in the Bible, this one has nothing to do with the Messianic line. It has nothing to do with bringing Christ into the world. It's just God giving someone a child as a way of saying thanks. The Lord can do that. And, just because somebody was a helper to the prophet, so God has no trouble helping out these ordinary people, these nameless people. We don't even know her name or the child's name or her husband's name or anything like that. We just know she's a Shunammite woman. And that's about all we have to go on. But then, verses 18 and onward, the situation changes. And I'm going to volunteer to read verses 18 through 28. Verses 18 through 28. Okay, so as quickly as we're told about her having the child dies. The unexpected life of the child gives way to unexpected death. Why does God take away the son that He gave this woman? Why does He do that? Right. Yes. Yes. There's a lot of that kind of thing going on. It's like Jesus encounters this blind man in John 9, and they ask, well, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he became blind? Jesus says, you got it all wrong. It's not because anybody sinned. It's because the power of God, so that the power of God may be demonstrated in him. It's the glory of God may be revealed through him. And she puts this as God. If we're going to compare this Shunammite and his wife to Abraham and Sarah receiving an unexpected child, almost the very next thing we read about in Genesis after Isaac is born is that the Lord shows up and says, Abraham, I want you to sacrifice Isaac. Wait, you're going to give me a child and you're going to immediately take him away. This is perplexing. And it ought to be perplexing to us, because we're supposed to find it that way. But of course, Abraham, being the man of faith that he was, knew that considered that God would be able to raise the dead, and went ahead and obeyed God. And the Lord stopped him before he sacrificed Isaac, but the text of Hebrews says that he received him back as a type in Hebrews chapter 11. It's a similar sort of thing going on here. There's a resurrection story taking place, but in order to have resurrection, somebody has to die first. Now, the Shunammite, she goes to Elisha for help. She puts the child on Elisha's bed, shuts the door, goes out. She tells her husband she needs a donkey to go see the man of God. What she doesn't do is she doesn't tell her husband why she's going to see the man of God. She doesn't tell him that their son's dead. Kind of a big omission of information if your son is dead. Her husband is puzzled by her behavior. It's not the new moon. It's not the Sabbath. Why in the world would you go to Elisha right now? Apparently in Israel it was custom to meet with the prophets on both the Sabbaths and the first of the month or the new moons. Amos chapter 8 makes reference to the same practice as well. But these meetings, I guess it might be the closest thing they had in Israel to a worship service in the way we think of it. There was no temple, but there was a prophet there who would speak God's words. But what's fascinating to me about this is that the husband doesn't know what's going on. The only thing the Shunammite tells him when he asks what's up is, my Bible says it will be well. What she says is shalom. It's peace, basically. And so she doesn't want to talk to her husband. She just says shalom, which is the Hebrew form of hello or goodbye, depending on the context. The Shunammite has the servant drive the donkey at full pace. She comes to Elisha at Carmel. And Elisha sends Gehazi, the servant, out to meet her. And so Gehazi has all these questions, is it well with you? Is it well with your family? Is it well with your child? And she tells him what? It is well. Actually, she says shalom again. That's another thing. But she doesn't tell him that the child's dead. She doesn't tell Gehazi. And so this is a fascinating situation here. All this, she's not going to talk to anybody until she talks to Elisha. She's not going to talk to Gehazi, the servant. And when she gets to Elisha, she bows down, she grabs at his feet, and Gehazi won't stand for it. Gehazi has a lot in common with Jesus' disciples in the Gospels in terms of the silly things that he does. He tries to stop people from seeing his master. He fails to perform miracles, so his master has to come and do it for him. He does some other rather pig-headed things throughout the book. But Elisha says, leave her alone. Her soul is troubled within her, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. What can we learn from the fact that Elisha doesn't actually know what's going on in verse 27? God doesn't reveal everything to the prophet. The prophet isn't all-powerful. The miracles don't really come from him. He's not all-knowing either. Sometimes the Lord doesn't tell people what's going on. And it's a fascinating situation where the prophet doesn't know what's going on with this woman. Elisha's knowledge is incomplete because the power to know things was never actually his. It was the Lord who put those words in his mouth. Even God's servants genuinely don't have all the answers. That doesn't stop Elisha from, of course, allowing her to speak, getting this information. In verse 28, the Shunammite's perplexity is expressed. Didn't I ask for a son? Didn't I beg you not to lie to me? Why does God bless only to take away? A protest similar to the widow in 1 Kings 17 and verse 18, where she says, What do I have to do with you, O man of God? You've come to bring my iniquity to remembrance and to put my son to death. What do we do in a situation where what God is doing doesn't quite make sense to us? Well, the resolution of this is in verses 29 through 37. 29 through 37. Can I get one more volunteer to read? All right, so and the resurrection of her son happens in two parts. First, Gehazi is sent to raise her son. He takes Elisha's staff in hand and he goes to the son, and what happens? Nothing. It kind of raises all kinds of questions. Is Elisha's staff the thing that has power? Is it like it was with Moses? Stretch out your staff over the land of Egypt and perform all these wonders. Divide the waters of the Red Sea. Send plagues upon the people. Is that what it is? Is the power in the stick that Elisha carries around? No. Well, and the woman swears not to leave Elisha, similar to how Elisha swore not to leave Elijah earlier in chapter 2. The woman's faith is persistent. Some people, when their child dies or when some other crisis strikes or some other terrible tragedy befalls them, they run from God. They run from God. They don't want anything to do with Him. They blame God for their situation. Well, she attributes the situation to God, but she doesn't run from God. I'm going to stay here. We're going to sort this out. She goes to the man of God because his God is the only one who can sort out the mess. By faith, this woman receives back her dead by resurrection. There is a similarity in interaction between Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman in the Gospels who persistently begged Jesus, even after Jesus said, it's not appropriate to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs. She still wouldn't let him go. It's the same thing with this Gentile woman here. Like Jesus, Elisha holds her at a distance and only caves after her persistence. But Gehazi, why does Gehazi fail? What's his problem? He shows up. His efforts fail. Is he not powerful enough? Is his faith? Is Gehazi only like the prophets of Baal whom Elijah defeated? No voice, no answer? It's similar to Jesus' disciples too, actually. In the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have this story. And in Luke chapter 9, after they come down from the Mount of Transfiguration, they've got this boy that keeps getting thrown into epileptic seizures. He's got a demon. The demon sometimes throws him into the fire, has him foaming at the mouth, and the disciples try to cast out this demon and they can't do it. And Jesus, Jesus' response is, well, to cast out the demon first. And the disciples, well, why couldn't we do that? How come you were able to do that and we couldn't? And because this kind only comes out by prayer and fasting, Jesus says. But implicitly, their problem is their lack of faith, their lack of trust in the Lord. Gehazi falls short of Jesus' disciples, in the same way that Jesus' disciples did. Elisha, is the power within him? No, it's not. How is this boy restored to life? What does Elisha do? He lies on him. What else does he do? He gives him mouth to mouth. If only somebody had tried that, right? You know. Went into the room and prayed. And that's the key part of this whole thing. It's another link between this story and 1 Kings chapter 17. Elisha comes to the house to find the boy dead. He shuts the door to work the miracle. No one else sees it. It's kind of like the previous miracle he's performed. Like Elijah before him, all he can do is pray. He doesn't, cut himself like the prophets of Baal did. He doesn't pull out his spell book and say the magic words. He doesn't mix all kinds of potions and snake oil and things like that. No, Elisha, he stretches himself out on the top of this child and he prays to the Lord. And eventually, after a lot of persistence in doing this, it doesn't happen right away. And that's all he can do is pray to the Lord. But after much persistence in prayer, the child sneezes. And I'll bet sneezes never sounded so healthy, right? No. Elisha restores the son to his mother. This is similar to the resurrection that we saw in 1 Kings 17. It's also similar to another resurrection story in the Bible. In Luke chapter 7, there's a funeral procession coming out of the city of Nain. The widow's son is dead, and Jesus shows up, tells the man to get off the cot. He rises to life, gets off the cot. Everyone's amazed at that. He restores this dead son to his widowed mother. What's fascinating about that is that Shunem, Nain, were actually on opposite sides of the same hill. So Jesus performs that miracle in the same town that this miracle was performed in hundreds of years ago. Now, maybe that's a coincidence, but it's kind of an interesting one if it is one. There's also a sneak preview of Jesus' resurrection and ours as well. This is a God for whom death is no object, for whom death is no obstacle. Power of death will be triumphed over by the Lord. Oh, okay, now that was one of the miracle stories in this chapter, in the Elisha sequence, are of unequal length. You got a short one that's 7 verses, and you got one that goes from verse 8 down to verse 37. The Shunammite resurrection. So I'll stop here after going through all that text and just ask, do y'all have anything you noticed? Observations, questions, things we missed? I wouldn't know. I mean, 7 is one of those numbers that's, the Hebrews love to play with, but I mean, it's hard to determine what its significance would be if there is any in the situation. I didn't think of anything on those lines. All right, well, the next thing that happens, we're talking about God's power over death. Let's get to verses 38 through 41. Who wants to read verses 38 through 41?
What?
All right. Now, actually, this story and the next story is dominated by the verb for eating. There's a lot of eating. the sons of the prophets and Elisha like to eat a lot together, but they keep getting into these bad situations, and Elisha has to bail them out every time they want to eat. The setting of the story is that it's in the middle of a famine. And where have we seen that before? Besides all over the place. Where have we seen that most recently? Let me ask that. Where did that happen recently in the Bible? Yes. 1 Kings 17, Elijah prayed that it would not rain, and there was no rain for 3 years by his word. So this is an instance, once again, there's a famine on the land. Now, next question we have to ask is, why do famines happen in the Bible? 99.9% of the time. What is the reason for a famine? Disobedience? Yeah, the nation of Israel did something bad, and they're being punished for it. Famines were curses of the covenant, Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28. They were the result of sin of the people. If they didn't keep the covenant, the Lord would not bless them with crops. But what's interesting about this whole mess is that one group of people is being affected by this famine, the sons of the prophets. That righteous remnant, that group of people that supposedly had not bowed the knee to Baal nor kissed him. Wait a second here. Are God's people exempt from the consequences of the nation's sins? No, they're not. It doesn't look that way. Now, does God protect them in times of crisis? Does God help them get through it? Yes, He does. But does that mean they're not going to suffer? Well, no. The fact that they're in the nation of Israel, among all these wicked people, they will suffer for that. Even if they themselves didn't specifically contribute to the nation's sins, they will suffer for the sins of their nation. The context of this story is this famine, and the famine will dominate the scene pretty much through the end of chapter 7, and really even into chapter 8, some. And in chapter 7 it gets worse because they get besieged by the Arameans around their city. In the time of famine, Elisha and his company prophets decide, let's make a stew. It's not like that story where they make stone soup and all the different people come out with their vegetables and throw them into the soup so they had something. What's more like this is one of the sons of the prophets decides he's going to make his little contribution of wild gourds to the stew. He didn't check the nutrition label on them, figure out what they were first, so he cut them up and put them into the stew. And unfortunately, it turned out to be a bad year for cucumbers. As they're eating, they realize that the stew is poisonous. There's death in the pot. Elisha, though, he has the answer. Just like he has the answer, just like at Jericho when they had bad water, here they've got bad stew. How does Elisha fix it? He dumps a bunch of flour into the stew. I'm not a culinary expert. I cook a little bit, but it's ironic that Elisha is a better cook than his servant who cooks for him. But what's the real lesson from this story? Is the power in the flour? Is the power in the prophet? How is it that this stew is really saved? It's God, again. Which, there's something kind of interesting about that, because we think, the Lord, in one story, the Lord raises the dead, and the next, He fixes a bad stew. It might have been a stew that killed them, but still, you kind of think, resurrection of the dead, cooking. Does the Lord care about what you eat? This instant, does He care about you not dying in a famine? What is the lesson we learn from this story? What are we supposed to get out of this? I'm sorry? Stay away from wild gourds. Okay, that's one. No. All right, man's ignorance of truth doesn't hold them exempt from it. Okay. Does God sometimes protect people from their mistakes? Does God sometimes save people from things they've, oops, shouldn't have done that? Does God sometimes provide in spite of human inadequacy? Huh? What was the what? Well, the closest thing I can think of towards that is what was it in Matthew 18:10? See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you, they're angels in heaven, continually see the face of my Father who is in heaven. But, I mean, more to the point, the Lord is saying in that text, he will hold accountable those who oppress these children, these little ones, and cause them to stumble. Now, right, right, this. And what we're looking at here is, in this particular instance, in 2 Kings 4, is, well, God provides for his people, even when they do some pretty boneheaded things to almost kill themselves in the process. But God provides in spite of human inadequacy. That's a lesson we can get out of this as well. He can provide in spite of human inadequacy. And we know he is able to do such a thing. I mean, how applied to our own salvation? Think about that for a minute. I mean, are we adequate to deliver ourselves? No. We're not adequate to, save ourselves. It's why the Lord sent Christ in the first place. Christ, the true bread of life. Save us from the death and the pot of our life stew. I don't know. That's an analogy I'm making up on the fly, so you probably shouldn't take it too seriously. But, okay, but talking about comparisons with Jesus, look at the next story, verses 42 through 44. 42 through 44. What do we have? Somebody read that for us. Okay. Miraculous provision of barley. Man from Baal Shalishah, which is a place named after Baal, he brings Elisha some bread and some first fruits. And as a passing note, this man comes from a place bearing Baal's name. It's providing food for a prophet of Yahweh during the famine. He could have given it to the priests of Baal, but he doesn't do that. I should have silenced my cell phone. He doesn't give his first fruits to the priests of Baal, but rather to the prophet of Yahweh. Now, what we saw in 1 Kings 19, where the Lord said there were 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal, that's still true. There's people in Israel who are genuinely faithful to the Lord. That righteous remnant is still there. And so this guy brings 20 loaves of barley and some fresh ears of grain, and Elisha gets the brilliant idea, yeah, let's feed everybody with this. Well, there's a small problem with feeding the people with 20 loaves of bread, and what is it? There's not enough to go around. You've got 100 people here, and you've only got 20 loaves of bread, and I don't know about you, but when I go to Olive Garden, I like to eat more than a fifth of a breadstick. So, what do we do in this situation? Well, what's Elisha's answer to this? Set it before them anyway. Right. They multiplied bread for 100. Kind of like the multiplied oil for the widow, kind of like the multiplied flour and oil for the widow of Zarephath. Kind of like another story where they didn't have enough bread to feed a bunch of people. You see that in the Gospels several times. It's the one story that's shared in all four Gospels is the feeding of the 5,000. As long as you don't count the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. But you get what I mean. But, besides that comparison, there's a key point that needs to be made here. What determines whether or not there's enough food to eat, according to this text? God said it. They had some left over according to the word of the Lord. When is 20 loaves enough to feed 100 people? When God says it's enough. When is 5 loaves and 2 fish enough to feed 5,000 people? When God says it's enough. When is anything possible? When God says it's possible. Not before, not after. The Lord's word is what determines what is and is not true. It's the lesson the Bible is constantly trying to drive home about food over and over again. Man does not live by bread alone. He lives by what? By every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Deuteronomy 8, verses 2 through 3. Why are you eating today? Is it because your pantry's stocked? No, it's because God said you would eat. That's why. Is it because you have enough money in the bank to buy food? That might be a corollary to it, but it's because God said you would eat today, that you eat today. Will you eat food tomorrow? You will, if God says you will. And that, I think, is the real lesson of all of this, that stuff doesn't happen without God say so. And people are provided for when God says so. Man has his part to play. He provides the bread to start with, sure. There's a lesson in that. That's true. At the end of the discussion, of course, it's like Israel in the wilderness. The manna comes from heaven. They can be obedient to the Lord and get the manna. They can leave it on the ground and not eat for the day. But, at the end of the day, they're dependent on the word of the Lord for their food. And that, we're not getting anywhere without the Lord. That's the bottom line on all that. Any comments or questions down to the end of chapter 4? All right. We will read chapter 5 next time. I actually have new handouts for chapter 5 all the way down to chapter 8. Kind of work through that. Again, we're giving this out piecemeal. I'll go ahead and pass these out, and you can have them for next Sunday. Thank you all for your attention.